مرحبا بكم مشاهدينا في حوارات السياق. دخلت الحرب الروسية الأوكرانية أسبوعها الثالث في ظل تمسك طرفي النزاع بموقفهما وسط تزايد أعداد القتلى بين الجانبين. عموما للمزيد من المتابعة حول هذا الملف ينضم إلينا جيسون نيكولز أستاذ العلوم السياسية في جامعة ميريلاند واشنطن. أستاذ جيسون مرحبا بك معنا.
Thank you for having me.
كيف تقيم التطورات الميدانية حتى الآن؟
Well, what's happening in Ukraine is tragic. We see right now the aerial assault of the Russian army, and the Ukrainian army just really can't keep up, of course, with a superpower like Russia militarily. We know that there have been about 6,000 Russian soldiers that have perished in this conflict, and that's really an embarrassment to the Russian military and to Vladimir Putin. So, of course, he's changing his strategy by using an aerial assault. And I think we were all horrified by what we saw with the attacks on civilian targets, particularly the children's hospital that was hit, I believe, yesterday. And so I think a lot of people are very troubled by what we're seeing. It doesn't look like these peace talks and these talks for a ceasefire are productive right now. The Russians want total surrender. And they want, of course, all of these assurances about Ukraine joining NATO and Ukraine not joining NATO, and of course that Ukraine will never join the EU. And I think that Ukraine is probably open to some of those things, but they will not surrender. So surrender is a non-starter. It looks like this is going to continue. And we've seen almost 2 million people have left Ukraine, causing a refugee crisis in other countries. So I think it's really a tragic situation, and I don't honestly see any kind of end to it anytime soon.
هل كان أداء المقاومة الأوكرانية مفاجئا بالنسبة لك كمختص وأكاديمي؟
No, actually it didn't, and I think it's going to continue because one thing we know, the Russians are vulnerable, as any military is vulnerable to guerrilla warfare and guerrilla attacks. And of course, the Ukrainians are defending their own territory, their own homes, their own property. And of course, that will motivate anyone. We've seen that, of course, the United States has seen that several times, whether in Vietnam or in the Middle East, where we've gone into other people's territory as the most powerful nation in the world. And sometimes we've been defeated. So I expected the Ukrainians to fight with all of the might and the heart that they've shown in this particular offensive by the Russians. We've seen the Russians try to do this in Afghanistan, and they fought for 10 years and they lost. So I expected a very fierce resistance from the Ukrainians, and for this not to be a quick war. And even if the Russians were able to take Kyiv, that the Ukrainians were going to continue to fight. And I think you're going to see this. This is going to be a long, protracted, prolonged conflict. The Ukrainians are not going to stop fighting. They're not going to give up. And I think that this is going to be very drawn out because Mr. Zelensky doesn't look like he wants to give up. They're not going to agree to surrender. And the Russians want complete and total surrender. So this is going to last a long time. I think the Ukrainians are going to continue to fight with all of the might and heart that they've shown to protect their homeland.
القوات الروسية لا زالت تحاصر مدنا أوكرانية عدة. ما الذي سيحدث لها برأيك؟
Well, I think, as long as the Russian army is surrounding these towns and they're going in and they're bombing them from the air, I think we're going to see more civilian casualties. And I think that's tragic. We're going to see, people dying, hospitals not able to function to take care of the wounded, all of the things that we see during war. And this is why I think civilized people need to be anti-war. We need to avoid war at all costs. And this is why I think the whole world needs to be united in admonishing Russia and admonishing Vladimir Putin for this offensive. I think this is going to be a difficult time for the Ukrainian people. I think that the Ukrainian refugees are going to be left out of their homes and left out of those cities. And once they take Kyiv and Mariupol and some of the other Kherson and some of the other Ukrainian cities, the resistance gets a lot more difficult for Ukraine. It's much easier for the Russian army to come in and take some of the other territory. It's really been the resistance has been strongest in the cities, particularly around the major cities. And if the Russians are able to, besiege those cities and claim that territory, I think the rest of the country will become, will fall under Russian control.
الأمر بات إلى حد كبير يشبه الحروب بالوكالة، أقل على الجانب الأوكراني مع تسليحه من قبل الولايات المتحدة والدول الغربية، أليس كذلك؟
So I wouldn't call it a proxy war. I think that the United States certainly is backing its ally, and its ally in this particular case is Ukraine. Of course, Poland and NATO are very concerned about Russian aggression, and this is really the purpose for NATO. And as a matter of fact, if there's one thing that Vladimir Putin has done, it's unified NATO. It's made NATO actually stronger and made NATO a much stronger alliance when NATO, arguably was starting to drift apart and people were actually questioning its relevance. And now Vladimir Putin has actually made it even more relevant. I think that it's clear, though Ukraine is not part of NATO, Ukraine is an American ally. It's a Polish ally. It's a Hungarian ally, and NATO wants to keep Russia from moving further westward. So I don't think it's necessarily a proxy war. I do understand your point, particularly when it comes to the Polish and them providing the MiG aircraft for the Ukrainians to be able to defend themselves from the air.
طيب، في البداية سمعنا أن الولايات المتحدة طلبت من بولندا طائرات حربية، وقتها رفضت بولندا هذا الطلب، ثم عادت وتراجعت ووافقت لتعود الولايات المتحدة وتقول إن الأمر سيهدد بتوسيع الصراع. كيف تفهم هذا التردد في الموقف الأمريكي؟
First of all, we have to really look at this broadly, and we have to understand that the United States just withdrew from a 20-year war last year. Less than a year ago, we just got out of a 20-year unpopular war, and the American people do not want war. And of course, this is all about politics, and though we care for the Ukrainian people, first of all, World War III, which was what it would be if the United States were to directly engage Russia, would not be good for the Ukrainian people. It would not be good for the Polish people. It would not be good for Belarus. It would not be good for Latvia, Estonia, anyone in that region. And it certainly wouldn't be good for the United States and our economy. And of course, our soldiers, our men and women in uniform. So, of course, we want to avoid war. The Biden administration certainly wants to avoid war with Russia at all costs. And we do know that Vladimir Putin is right now increasingly isolated. He's in a position where he, could potentially, see any kind of direct involvement by the United States as a declaration of war. And we want to avoid that. We want to avoid, of course, the nuclear threat that comes if the United States and Russia get involved in a war. And that will cause massive casualties. And ground zero will be Ukraine. So that would be even worse for the Ukrainian people. So I think looking at it from all of those different perspectives, that's the reason why the United States is saying, no, you can't use an American airfield. Anything that might be seen by the Russians as a direct provocation into war is going to lead us into a world war. And that would be bad for the entire globe. Indirectly and certainly for that region directly.
طيب، ماذا عن المفاوضات المباشرة بين روسيا وأوكرانيا وغير المباشرة كاتصالات ماكرون وبنت والأتراك مؤخرا؟ هل هناك أي مؤشرات إيجابية؟
Well, I think it's good that, the world makes it clear to Russia and to Vladimir Putin that this will not be tolerated, and that, of course, peace is best for everyone, including Russia. And I think even though they are negotiating peace, they are making it clear that Russia is suffering because of this attack. They can't sell oil to the United States. They can't, companies are shutting down. I think it was McDonald's shut down in Russia, and that's 850 restaurants, probably employs 15,000 people, and they're not, able to work. The banks have been sanctioned. So the Russian economy, of course, the ruble has gone down and is worth, I think, 1 penny. Here in the United States, it would be worth 1 penny. So this is a situation that has been to Russia's detriment. And I think that these countries are going and saying, look, it would be in everyone's best interest, including your own, to stop this offensive, stop this war. You really don't have any allies. You only have people who are going to call for peace. And peace is what's best for everyone involved. I think it's good that all of these world leaders, even Turkey, is getting involved and are going in and making it clear, making their case to the Russian leadership.
أوكرانيا حتى الآن فازت بالحرب الإعلامية، هل لذلك أي تأثير على التطورات وتقدم الروس على الأرض؟
Well, I think it's had an impact in many different ways. Of course, Ukraine has been able to garner sympathy and empathy from around the world, and that also has translated to money. There have been people who have donated money, whether it's through cryptocurrency and other means, to the Ukrainian resistance. And I think that has been to the benefit of the Ukrainians. That allows for them to be able to arm their citizens and to arm their military. And also there are many aid workers who have come to help Ukrainian refugees because they feel so much empathy for the Ukrainians. I will say, though, I think that some of the empathy that the Ukrainians have received and the way they've been embraced with open arms in places like Poland and Hungary is quite interesting, because there were refugees from Syria, from Iraq, and from Afghanistan who needed the same amount of help and were turned away. And I will tell you, I believe that in part that has to do with race, and it has to do with religion. And I think the Western world needs to own that, and the Western world needs to acknowledge that they have their biases about which lives they believe are worthwhile and worthy. But at any rate, the Ukraine has certainly won the media war, and that has helped them in many different ways, in terms of being able to have homes and the help of these other governments when their refugees flee, and the funding that they've gotten on the ground for their resistance.
سأبني على حديثك هنا، لماذا أخذ الصراع في أوكرانيا أهمية دولية أكثر من اليمن من فلسطين؟
When you talk about Palestine and Israel, that's a really complicated issue, and I think that involves a whole lot. Some of it is, I think some of it is race, but I think that gets into, going back to 1948 and the United States and also with our Jewish community, and there's a whole lot that goes into that particular one. But I do think the fact that we don't talk about Yemen, there are babies and children and pregnant women starving to death in Yemen, but yet the United States and all these countries, our media doesn't cover that. We'll cover somebody's tweets rather than cover the fact that there are people who are starving and dying in Yemen and in Syria and in other places. And I think that it is because the Ukrainians are European. And if you listen to some of the figures in our media, even some of the major nonpartisan outlets, they've pretty much said that this is race, this is racial. They've used words, loaded words like, calling the Ukrainians civilized. And, the implication is that other people aren't civilized. So I think that it's really troubling. And of course, the United States, we have a history of racial issues and racial strife. And it's something that, we've been dealing with for now hundreds of years. And it's always entered our foreign policy as well. And that's something that I think that people don't talk enough about. We don't talk about what's going on, like you said, in Yemen. We don't talk about the fact that there are things going on throughout the continent of Africa. There's a civil war in Ethiopia, and the violence in Sudan and Central African Republic and the DRC.
ما الذي سيخرج به بوتين من هذه الحرب؟ حتى الآن الأوضاع سياسيا، عسكريا، استراتيجيا، اقتصاديا أسوأ بالنسبة إليه مما كان عليه الأمر قبل الغزو.
Well, I think he's angered by the response. And of course, the fact that Russia is not able to sell its oil as freely. They still may be able to sell it to the EU, we'll see, but certainly not to the United States. And the United States is turning to alternatives to try to augment, its loss of Russian oil. And that's hurting Russia. All of the sanctions are hurting Russia. They're hurting the Russian economy. Their economy is tanking. And the widespread condemnation, I think, has frustrated Vladimir Putin. I think what Putin now, he's dug his heels in a little deeper, and what he wants is for an assurance that Ukraine will never join NATO, that they will not join the EU, that they surrender, that they recognize Donbass as an independent area. And I think ultimately he may want for Zelensky to be out, and I don't think he wants to bring Yanukovych back, but I do think he wants to install a more Russia-friendly government in Ukraine. I think there is an off-ramp for this entire conflict if Vladimir Putin is willing to take it, and that is to have Ukraine be claimed as neutral territory rather than either joining, NATO, or at least there being a moratorium on joining NATO for a decade or what have you. I think there are ways to give Vladimir Putin a diplomatic off-ramp, but the question is, will he take it? I think that part of this is about his historic legacy, and he wants to win this conflict. And now he sees it's him against the world, and he's even more determined to try to use his influence right now and try to win this war.
شكرا أستاذ جيسون نيكولز، أستاذ العلوم السياسية في جامعة ميريلاند الأمريكية، للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق. مشاهدينا شكرا على طيب المتابعة، إلى الملتقى.